Hello there, and welcome to the Second Life Book Club. My name is Draxtor, and today's guest is Eliot Peper, novelist, consultant to tech companies, writer of technological thrillers. I plowed through his analog series. It's a trilogy, and boy, it is so relevant. It is so inspiring, and we are actually in a replica of a set piece in the trilogy, the club analog. If the camera can cam around a little bit, this was built by Ruby with the help of Arieto and Silas and Shyla. This is a club analog, and we'll talk about the significance of club analog in the book series. But I just want to show you guys how absolutely amazing this venue is. I don't know if we can keep it up and build a new set every week. We'll see when we get burned out. But Eliot Pepper is in the house. We'll introduce him in a second. I want to give a quick summary of the book and set the scene. At the center of the analog trilogy is this Silicon Valley company that runs the so-called feed, which pretty much the entire world is jacked into 24/7. So the feed is kind of a curated internet stream, somehow fed directly into your brain. And Elliot never really explains in detail how this is accomplished tech-wise, which I applaud him for this choice. We'll ask him later why he chose to do that. In the analog trilogy, he explores how politicians, lobbyists, oligarchs, hackers with a progressive agenda use the feed or its absence to further their goals. Some strive for market domination as they profit from climate disaster. Uh, the book deals a lot with so-called disaster capitalism. The hacktivists, they want to implement software socialism, as one of the baddies in the book puts it. The baddie is of course from Texas, hence my accent. But the book to me is like, I mean, it's an ode to optimism. I would say it's a tight techno thriller with multiple points of view, and it has this optimistic, you know, outlook. It has everything that you want from James Bond or 24, minus the superficial takes on geopolitical issues. And Eliot, thank God, does not offer simplistic solutions to these big issues of climate change, wealth inequality, disaster capitalism. It's very good stuff. Welcome, Eliot Pepper, to the Second Life Book Club.
Well, thank you so much, Drax. And I have to say, it's a bit of a trope to say that it's a pleasure to be here whenever you're being interviewed about one of your books. But this time, it really is a pleasure to be here. It's such a treat to see the set that your team has built for this, and how many of the little details you were able to realize and include from the actual physical analog club in the books. And
Yeah,
it's just really cool. I'm delighted.
the club in the book is you describe it as vast. Of course, we didn't have the space. We were running actually out of space. We have so much stuff on the book club. But behind you are these dogs and the hearth and these tapestries on the wall. And again, big shout out to Ruby and Arieto who put this together. Elliot, I want to start with the most important question of all. You
Hmm.
recommended when I first got in contact with you about because you're a prolific author, there's a bunch of stuff out there. Why did you recommend this series and not your latest book, Veil? You don't like your latest? You want to bury it somehow?
So I love Veil, and I'd be happy to discuss that anytime. But I thought that the analog trilogy would be really special to have a conversation about within SL, simply
Hmm.
because the background for the future that the trilogy takes place in features this ubiquitous digital feed that it basically mediates every experience that people
Hmm.
have, and I thought that would be particularly fun to discuss in a virtual world, and so that's why I selected it for this one, and hopefully we'll make good on those themes in this conversation.
Well, now that I'm hooked, I'm gonna inhale your other books too. But I mean, this is really also. I'm really delighted that, like I said, you are talking about these really big relevant issues in in this within the genre. And as a matter of fact, I want to start with, and we'll have you read as well. So audience, don't be afraid. But I want to start with something because the well-known media theorist Marshall McLuhan, who coined the term "the media is the message," and then he wrote a book afterwards, "The Media is the Massage." But he actually wrote in an essay, and I don't know where this is. Maybe somebody in the audience can look this up. He said that if you read page 69 from any book, you pick up a book at the store, at the library, you open it to page 69, you read this page, you will get a sense of the book and you will know immediately if this book is for you. So I have the first of your trilogy, Bandwidth, now in my hand, and this is actually only half a page because it's chapter 15. So I'm going to read this to get people a feel, give people a feel of what this may entail. This is page 69, so this is supposed to tell us if this is good or bad, or if this is for us, rather. Here we go. "What I want to know," said Dag, "is why I'm here." Emily didn't bother to look up from where she was working in the garden. A murder of crows exploded from a distant copse of trees, screeching and wrestling as they pursued each other. The pungent smell of compost mixed with the sharp aroma of freshly cut grass. "If we're going to chat," she said, "then you may as well get down here and help me." Dag paused for a moment and then knelt in the dirt beside her. She handed him a dandelion weeder and then returned to pulling up various flora that had invaded the pumpkin patch. "What you have to understand about the island," she said, punctuating her clauses by tossing clumps of bluegrass onto the pile of trimmings, "is that I didn't intend for it to turn out like this. I never meant to build an empire. I just wanted to help my friends. But favors are accretive. The more you do, the more you can do. People learn they can rely on you and come to you when they need something. If you help them, they're always eager to return the favor. Without you even realizing it, your bank of karma can grow too big to fail." Isn't this amazing, Elliot? I really think, like, it has everything in there. It has like islands, uh, as a hint of empire, I guess, and some mystery. You're thinking of the TV show Lost, maybe because you're on an island or whatever. That's page 69.
Yeah, that's really cool. I love I love the McLuhan rule, and it's interesting because the idea for the entire trilogy started on a hike in
Hmm.
the hills above the East Bay. I live here in Oakland, California, and I was on a hike with my wife and our dog, and I just right in the middle of the hike had the idea for Emily there and her backstory as a character. So the character who was gardening in that little excerpt, and so she's really where this story started. And so it's quite cool that she shows up at the appropriate page that to serve the McLuhan rule.
Emily is a super interesting character, and actually, the third book is. These books are from multiple points of view. I want to ask you why you chose those characters and not others. Super interesting. Emily is a super tough woman, very dedicated to progressive causes. And one of the big questions that you ask in the series is like, how far should we go to further these causes, to fight for these causes? Where's the line? Where's the moral barometer? And Emily oversteps this line, actually, according to herself. Um, we'll get into that. I want to do a quick housekeeping before I forget. Very quick, Book Club Island is open 24/7. We have about 200 people come through here every day exploring. We're adding more floating platforms with different themes every week. The flagship show is every Wednesday at 12 o'clock. The show is produced by Strawberry, Linden, and myself. Associate producer and researcher is Shyla the Super Gecko. She's here in the audience. Location manager, prop master, and master builder Ruby Geek and Arieto Chiori. Other contributors to the island: Marian McCann, Arden Schwartzman, Theanine, AJ McDowell. The avatars are customized by Kralos, and sometimes they're built from scratch by Silas Merlin. Big thanks to Brett and Patch from Linden Lab. and all the moles. And bigger thanks, of course, to our wonderful community of book lovers. I say this every week. Um, Now back to analog. So before we go into a reading, I said earlier that this to me is an ode to optimism. I mean, you deal with
Mm.
people with like really big themes that could really like, I mean, that are frustrating to look at how slow they move. I mean, the response to the climate disaster. But your book is very optimistic. As a matter of fact, you have a quote in the beginning. Um, I don't have it in front of me right now. But I'm impressed with your dedication to offer something that combats cynicism in cynicism is kind of like a pseudo intellectual justification for apathy, I guess. But what was your overall premise with this? I mean, you mentioned Emily was the first character, but did you actually maybe set out something like I want to do a positive something that offers a positive take or activates people that something is possible in our messed up world?
So, I think that this really is an underlying theme in all of my work, not even just this trilogy, which is just that we have big problems, right? I mean,
Mhm.
it's so easy to see. You look at the world around us. From climate change to geopolitics to literally anything. We're sort of surrounded by these big problems, and we're reminded of them all the time. And it's really easy um, to get sucked in. So I mean, there are the obvious things that people talk about in terms of filter bubbles and sort of news organizations really talking only about big problems, but it's easy to do in our personal lives as well. I mean, I know that uh, at dinner with my family, very often we wind up talking about all the things wrong in the world. And that's true. Those problems are there. They're big, they're messy, they're hard to fix. But the only thing that makes it worse is if you decide to stand by, right?
Mhm.
The problems may be very, very difficult, but they're certainly never going to get solved if no one tries.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so I'm a big fan of trying to take action, no matter how small, right?
Mhm.
And trying to think about, okay, if I'm in a conversation with a friend and I find myself sort of complaining about the state of the world, where could I take that so that we don't end the conversation with just complaining about the state of the world? Where can I take that that might give an opportunity for to take action? So, like, I'll give you one very small example. Um, my I'm a first generation American. My mother is Canadian and my father is Dutch, and my Dutch grandparents fled fled Holland shortly after World War II. My paternal grandfather was Jewish, and he was the only survivor of World War II. And my paternal grandmother was in the Dutch resistance, and so they fled to the U.S. and found a home here. And my wife is Colombian, and so we're two. I'm a first generation American. She's
Mhm.
Colombian, and as an immigrant. And we were talking about how hard it's been in the past few years for folks that are trying to move to the United States. So we
Mhm.
decided to work with a local nonprofit and host a refugee in our home for 9 months and help them integrate and help them find a job and help them figure out how to make sense of this very complex system that is life in America.
Mhm.
And so, does that solve the macro problem of the refugee crisis? Absolutely not. There are
Wow.
huge, big system and trends at work here, but finding a way to take a concrete action in your own life can really shift your perspective. And so it certainly shifted mine. And so I try to channel that in my fiction. I try to grapple with big problems and not let it end only with that grappling, to try to actually figure out, okay, what might be done about it, even if there's no happy ending.
This is really wonderful. This is a wonderful story, and also what I really like about your books as well. You walk and chew gum at the same time. Just like with your own story here. There is something that we can individually do, but very often, especially in the Silicon Valley realm. I mean, I lived Silicon Valley adjacent for a very long time, and I
Mm,
very often hear this expressed, this from libertarians primarily, of course. Oh yeah, it's all about individual action, and we don't
mm,
really need any type of policy engagement. And in your books, you just you said, well, we need to kind of fight on both fronts. We need to
mm-hmm,
fight in the institutional realm, as agonizing as that can be, as it works slowly, and at the same time we can do these smaller things in our specific community.
mm.
uh, I think that's really important because that often gets lost in the public discussions, and also, of course, nefarious actors want to tell us that there is really no place for, or no need, I guess, for oversight and all that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, and so I mean, part of this is that I'm a total nerd, and I've always loved trying to make sense of human systems. So I actually went to graduate school for public policy
Oh,
and
uh-huh.
studied international environmental treaties. And so I love, like, the problems of human collaboration are fascinating and timeless, right? Like, we face them just as our ancestors did. And I actually think that, the sort of gap in discourse that you just pointed out, where it's really easy to zoom in on an individual and the choices they make, but it's harder to zoom out and look at the systems in which they're embedded. I think that's actually very common in storytelling too, whether it's journalism or fiction. Um,
Mhm.
Trying to dramatize a problem or a story or something like that, like, you, by definition, like, stories are about people. And so you're telling a story about one person's life, and it can be hard to dramatize the problems that happen with human collaborations when you zoom out a little bit and try to encompass that system. So that's something that I've really tried to do in these books, but I can also say that it's really tough, like, from a creative perspective,
Oh
as a
yeah.
novelist,
Absolutely,
trying to,
because if you
yeah,
get into 50 pages of policy discussions, people are,
right,
dude, you
right,
gotta, where are the bad guys chasing you down with an M16? Where are
right.
they?
And I think the reverse is true as well. So when
Hmm.
you talk to folks who are really steeped in policy discussions, which I find fascinating conceptually and intellectually, very often those discussions lack the bridge to the personal. They lack, they don't make that final connection to, okay, now that we understand this big picture thing in a new way, how does that connect to you and your life and what you might be able to do about it, or what it
Right.
means to you, what it means to your family, your community, your children, whoever. And so I think that it's sort of, it's almost like there are two groups of people talking only amongst each other sometimes. And
Right.
so
Absolutely.
I think that, it's really wonderful to try to bridge that conversation to the extent possible.
If you're just tuning in, you're watching or listening to the Second Life Book Club with our guest Eliot Pepper today. I'm monitoring the chat on YouTube, so you can ask questions there as well. Also monitoring Twitter. Here's a bunch of things coming in on YouTube. Also here in World. So if this goes by quickly, just cut and paste your questions in World. I'm glancing at the local chat. But before we do a little reading, I'm interested in you mentioned your own background uh, with your parents coming from other countries. In the book, there is the character Diana, and and she's a spy. She's
Mm-hmm.
hardcore. I mean, there's a lot of cool action scenes. Also, kudos how you write these action scenes. I mean, they're awesome. And she is, and what I love about this, in the very beginning of book number two, I think she says something like America can do no wrong. And you hear this very often from immigrants who come from bad situations. I'm painting with a broad brush here, but they view
Hmm.
America as really their savior, and some of those folks are somewhat uncritical. I mean, understandably so. And if you then sort of talk with them, and I had this experience myself, say, wait a minute, America has done some pretty nasty things. If you talk about foreign policy, 1973 Chile, or you bring up stuff like that, Latin America, and people go, no, 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 America is the greatest, and they don't want to hear it. So Diana, in your book, makes that transition pretty quickly in the narrative, not quickly in her life. I mean,
Hmm.
she's a full-on patriot for a long time, but then in the narrative of book number two, um, is that something that you experienced in your own life when you talk with immigrants from other places, that they're a little bit, let a lot of things slide because America has been good to them?
Yeah, I mean, I think that
Exceptionalism, I guess, is the term. What's the
sure,
term? Uh,
American exceptionalism. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that there are a few, at least when I make sense of that, there are a few sort of intersecting concepts. So one is that the U.S. has done a really amazing job at PR globally,
Hmm.
right? So the fact that Hollywood movies are sort of the standard for film storytelling worldwide.
With a
That
little help from some government agencies and defense agencies
right,
tweaking the script here and there, and lending
right.
some big nice gear to showcase.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So there are just so many channels through which the U.S. in the past 70 years has really done a really like powerful job of telling its story from its perspective in the way that it wants to. So I think that's part of it. I also think that that there I mean, in terms of people's human experience, there are wonderful things about the U.S. Like, for example, the refugee we hosted, uh, fled from Uganda, where LGBT people are persecuted brutally, and so
Hmm.
coming to the United States, he could he could live here without fear that that he would be in danger walking down the street
Yeah,
because
his
of who he
life. Hmm.
was, right? So
Hmm.
I don't want to I don't know undersell the fact that anyone who is an American is incredibly privileged to take advantage of the many wonderful things this country has to offer. But many of the things that this country has to offer are built on a very sordid history, as you mentioned, and have incredible side effects. I mean, it's power corrupts, right? And the United States is very powerful and has done some really really nasty things and continues to do some really nasty things. And many of the systems that we have that are the institutions that make up this country are broken and have some really really difficult truths that a lot of people like to gloss over. And so
Hmm.
in this book, part of Diana's journey is that, as you say, she starts out as a patriot, really really believing in the fact that not only the ideals that the country stands for, but the actual institutions implementing them are fundamentally moral, even if they make certain mistakes. And over the course of the story, she really discovers the true human impact of the power that she's been working so hard to uphold,
Right.
and has to come to terms with that and figure out what to do about it.
And that some major players are really, frankly, doing criminal things, including
Right.
murder and so forth. There's a bunch of questions here. Shyla, our senior researcher, has a funny question here. Some people say that utopian fiction reads like a term paper on how to run a hippie. I'm going to add how to run a hippie co-op. But you kind of address this too. I mean, but
Sure.
briefly, we'll talk about craft too later on. But
Yeah.
briefly, I mean, what's the trick here? Because we talk about this often here on the book club. People say, utopian is utopian novels are all fine and good. good, but they're really boring. It's not good for drama. It's not good for entertainment. We need dystopia. While at the
Hmm.
other end, and Cory Doctorow is very vocal about that, as are others, saying, I'm done with dystopian stuff because it's
Right.
so ubiquitous, and dystopian stuff can, if you constantly consume it in whatever medium, can actually really limit your imagination, right? It's just like, oh yeah, we're gonna go to hell in a handbasket anyways.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. So I actually find this fascinating because many reviewers have described my book, the series, as dystopian, and other
Hmm.
reviewers have described it as utopian. And so I find those sort of categories fascinating. And they, as a writer, when I approach a story, what I find interesting is, so I feel like often one of the reasons why utopias can feel boring or preachy is
Hmm.
because they provide they try to provide an answer, right? Like this is how the
Yeah,
world
exactly.
should work,
Yeah.
right? And dystopias, I think, can actually be boring for really similar reasons, which is that they also are prescriptive. They say this is how things don't, shouldn't work, right?
Right.
And so sometimes, and not always, there are amazingly well told dystopian and utopian stories, but sometimes they can sort of take on the tone of an op-ed or something, right? Where it's like,
Yes.
I'm going to tell you how things work. And when and I can only speak for myself, but when I write about imagined futures, I'm not interested in answers. To me, what is really fascinating to explore in a novel form, where it's a long story and you have to explore different nooks and crannies and figure out how the characters' lives change. I'm interested in difficult questions.
Right.
So when I work on a book, I actually try to think about all of the questions that I can't come up with good answers to.
Hmm.
And the process of writing the novel is a process of just wrestling with that question and its implications and all the messy shades of gray that are between any possible extreme. And so I try to see, when I see that reviewers are describing my books as both dystopian and utopian, I see that as a win, because from my perspective, they're neither. I'm really interested in what is possible, what are the important questions that underlie what's going on in the world right now, rather than trying to tell readers, hey, this is how things should work.
Right. We have a lot of really good questions here in the chat, so please repost them. But I do want Elliot to give us a little taste of the book. So if I could ask you to attempt to stand up by hitting the stand button here in Second Life. This is the fun part where usually our guests fall off the stage, but since we don't have a stage, and now turn slightly to your right and walk forward to the book. There's a book display in front of you. If you turn, there you go, and now walk a little forward here. We do this intentionally because people love newbies. Um,
I'm very much a newbie, as you can
yeah,
easily see.
so go a little forward. Here's. I'm gonna put it a little closer. Here we go.
Oops,
I'm
there we
gonna.
go.
Oh, that's good, good, good. I'll put it in front of you. And let me just also say that we're here in the Club Analog, which in your trilogy is the only place where the feed, and again, the feed in your stories is piped straight into people's brains, and they can, with their thoughts, they can kind of direct it, but it's also very curated by the company and based on algorithms. It's kind of Facebook without the nasty stuff, I guess, or maybe. Well, I'll ask you about that too. And where we here in Club Analog in your book is the only place where there is no feed. And in the book, a lot of celebrities hang out here at Club Analog to find solace and a little quiet time, including living legend, creator of cyberpunk, William Gibson. And if the camera could please briefly um, move over to the side here, where in a booth there is actually William Gibson typing away on a typewriter, sitting here together with our friend Tamu and a little otter by the name of Water. And we have no idea what William Gibson is writing, but anyway, Elliot, what are you going to read for us from Bandwidth? This is a scene with Emily, who runs a place of kids who are often runaways, come from abusive childhoods, and these guys are progressive activists. They hack into the feed, and she is here with Dag. What else do we need to know to set up this scene?
Well, maybe before I start, one quick logistical question.
Please.
Are we going to do all three readings at some point today, or should I choose one of the three to do right now?
I'm looking at the time. I think we can do all three. I think they
Okay,
amount to a
great.
total of like 12, 13 minutes total or so.
Okay,
Um, uh,
perfect.
yeah, absolutely.
Okay, yeah, so this actually ties in really nicely with the page 69 excerpt that we started out with. Um,
Right,
uh,
it's kind of the same
It's,
setting.
yeah, the same segment in the story, and at this in this scene, Dag, who's the main character, is actually lying out on a lawn at midnight, and it actually fits the club we're sitting in right now really well, because him and Emily are looking up at the stars together, and standing here at this little reading stand through the doorway of analog behind the audience, I can see the night sky. So I think that sort of sets it up well, and I'll dive right in.
Oh, real quick, who is Dag? Dag is a former lobbyist. Well, he still is, and he does, he works for very good money, lobbying for any cause that pays. Some good, some pretty bad. Right?
Yes, yeah. So Dag is the hero of this story, and he really goes from being this political power player who is working on behalf of entrenched interests to basically extend their reach, and starts to realize all of the like all the shadow of all of these edifices he's building, and Emily really helps him see that. She's the head of this, effectively a hacker commune, and she opens his eyes to many of the things that he failed to understand.
All right, let's go.
Have you ever heard of Chateau de Chambord? Asked Dag. Nope. It's a palace in the Loire Valley. King Francois the First built it in the early 16th century. It's this enormous mansion, gray stone walls, conical towers, but the most opulent part is the sprawling lawns. Hunter-gatherers, ancient Egyptians, Socrates, none of them tended patches of grass in front of their homes. Think about it. Lawns are worthless. They take acreage and labor to maintain, yet produce nothing of value. Lawns were invented in the late Middle Ages by nobles who wanted to flaunt their wealth. Lawns are pure luxury. The bigger your lawn, the more land and peasants you needed to cultivate it. Lawns became a primary symbol of political power, so much so that the upwardly mobile merchants and other nouveau riche couldn't wait to grow their own. The industrial and information revolutions birthed a middle class itching to spend their Sundays mowing the grass in front of their cookie cutter suburban chateau. And now here we are, lying on yours. I never knew that, she said. Her laugh tinkled up into the night. It's a really cool story. It's a clever piece of trivia, said Dag, but the whole thing terrifies me. Everything we do, everything we believe, everything we are, we think it's ours to choose. His voice quickened, words rushing to get out. But even something as inconsequential as wanting a lawn in front of our homes isn't a true choice. It's the product of a never-ending series of historical accidents. We take the world we're born into for granted. We imagine that we control our thoughts and dreams. We think we're free to be who we want to be. But there's this vast hidden architecture that shapes us, and we don't even know it. It's like we're actors in a play who don't realize we're working off a script. Emily shifted on the grass next to him and let out a long exhale. Even actors have a choice, she said, serious again. Once you know there's a script, you can choose your own inflections. You can learn to improvise. You can make the play better. Understanding how things came to be frees us to imagine new possibilities. That's part of what our whole effort here is all about. But even your desire to fight the system as a product of personal history and cultural means, Dag waved a hand to encompass the Milky Way. You said the stars are an outlet for you because they're hopelessly beyond your control. He pounded the ground beside him. What makes you so confident that anything down here is so different? The twins told you about some of the results we've achieved so far, said Emily. Seeing real changes happen, even if they're small, makes me believe more change is possible. We're building momentum. She paused, but your question goes deeper than that. There was a moment of contemplative silence. A meteor traced a brief fiery arc across the sky above them. Ultimately, the only power we have is to choose how we see the world, she continued. We don't control what happens, but we do get to decide how to interpret what happens, how to synthesize it, what to do next.
Wonderful. This is Eliot Pepper reading from Bandwidth, and this is again, it's about agency and that we can do something. And Dag, the main character here, who yeah, has been lobbying on behalf of very nefarious players, is really transformed as every character in your book is transformed. And I want to actually go very quickly to read number 2 from Borderless, but one question here about the feed, and the next one has to do with the feed as well. Again,
Yeah,
the feed is curated, so I mentioned Facebook, the Facebook algorithm curates stuff, and of course we all know that it can be exploited, and it was exploited leading up to Trump's election and other things. What these progressive uh, hacktivists under Emily's guidance do is very cool, and I was so on Emily's side for a long time. But eh, they basically manually, if you will, curate the feed by sort of subtly influencing decision makers. In the case of one politician, they just feed the politician's wife a lot of content about child trafficking until the wife says to her husband, we got to do something against child trafficking. And then all of a sudden the ball uh, gets rolling. So what they do is a type of digital lobbying that is done, uh, that everybody does, but they do it for a very good cause. But then later on, the question again is, how far do you go for this cause? And I was very much on Emily's side until you made the case that Emily is kind of a technocrat in the sense that she is somewhat cynical about the general population. Basically, she thinks the general public is too stupid and they need to be told what to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you do that in a very nuanced way. But I mean, what's your take here on progressive causes? I mean, we're talking about, you talk here about concretely about a global carbon tax. Later, you talk
Yeah,
about a wealth tax. I mean, I'm very, very much on the left side of the spectrum. I would say, and again, there's nuance to this, but I'd say, I don't care. We need to really fight for these things tooth and nail. I mean, otherwise,
sure.
nothing comes easy, you know.
Yeah,
But you
so,
make a case in the book, I guess, that there is
uh-huh.
a moral, that there is a threshold, there's a line that you should not cross, I guess.
Right. Yeah. So just to break that down, I mean, the way that I look at this stuff is if you, so the way that I set up Emily and her team, everyone has read about algorithmic manipulation of, of different political issues, basically trying to use the internet to spin stories in a certain way and to shape public opinion in a certain way. But almost all of that is done again at a very large scale. So you're trying to you're trying to shape the narrative by shaping many different stories. You're trying to tweak the conversations happening across Twitter or across other social platforms. And the sort of conceit in the analog trilogy is that instead of doing everything at scale, that what if you zoomed in and did exactly the same kind of curation, but in an incredibly personal way? So what if you paired the kind of human intelligence that intelligence agencies like to do by working up dossiers and trying to make sense of every friend that you have, every incentive system that you personally operate under. What shows do you like? What do you do every week? And then you paired that with control of your feed, where when you open up your email, we're actually subtly tweaking the messages you see first or the messages that get through. Or when you open up your Netflix feed, there's a team of psychologists that know everything about you personally, that is choosing the kind of story to surface for you as your next recommended watch in order to push you, a like a targeted individual, toward a certain decision. So Drax, you mentioned, a senator. So if a senator was working towards making a certain policy decision, and they might react differently if they happen to see a really moving documentary about it 3 days before the vote. Right. So in this story, Emily is using the power of the feed to specifically create a personal filter bubble, effectively, for individual powerful people that they choose to target. And if she was doing that on behalf of causes, for example, for self-aggrandizement, if she was doing that in order to make a ton of money, or in order to persecute a group of people, that wouldn't be very interesting. She'd be a very classic villain, right? Like, I'm manipulating this incredibly important piece of information infrastructure in order to do something evil. But what's much more interesting is that she does it to do things that are ostensibly very utopian and optimistic. I share a lot of her values, right? And so I wanted to tease out, wow, what if you had someone who had that kind of sophistication and who had that kind of control and who was pursuing goals that you agreed with? How far would you let them take it before you started asking questions? And that's really where the book comes down to. And I think that for me, what makes that an interesting question to grapple with is that is it about means or is it about ends, right? I basically agree with all of Emily's ends, more or less. But the means that she chooses to get there are effective tactically. However, they in intentionally and highly specifically manipulating the people that her group is targeting, she is robbing them of agency.
And if that comes out, I mean, it goes without saying that if that, then that can be used by other bad faith actors. If that comes out and say, like, look, you got manipulated, and that's a backlash at scale. Fantastic. And I'll get to questions, so please retype them. Let's go to excerpt number 2. This is from the book Borderless. I'm going to bring up the reading stand and talking about the feed. This is a excerpt where the feed actually goes down, and again, the feed is completely ubiquitous. Everybody, not only in the US, everybody in the world has access to the feed, and the feed is fed into people's brains. And in Borderless, you describe a scenario that is where the feed does a lot of really good things. I mean, I understand, maybe I misread this, but I understand there's actually a Medicare for all type system, where the feed then kind of knows if you're in dire straits or have a medical issue, and they know how much money you make, or if you can't afford this, and then they feed you, sort of, so to speak, towards a free clinic or something like that. Those types of things. So in this book, the feed and the people who run the feed, who run this consortium, or the corporation, people on the board, they're all pretty good people. So it's a benevolent corporatocracy, I guess. Yummy.
Yeah, and eventually it goes off the rails. So yeah,
Of course, and thank you
yeah.
that you did, and thank you because otherwise I would have disinvited you, Elliot, to be quite honest.
Yeah, I figured. I would have disinvited myself. Come on. Yeah. So this I think this is actually a really fun excerpt for this group because in this book you have this ubiquitous feed that's basically Google plus Wikipedia plus Facebook plus everything else times 1,000. It's the digital shadow world, right? And it mediates everyone's human experience. But in the club that we are currently sitting in the books, that club is shielded from the feed. So when you're in the club, it's not there. But anytime you're in the rest of the world, the feed is there, and it's an integral part of your lived experience. And so in this scene, the feed gets shut off globally for the first time, and I'll dive right in.
Mhm.
Turn it off. The feed was the information infrastructure that empowered nearly every human activity and on which nearly every human activity relied. A talisman that lent mere mortals the power of demigods. Doctors used it for diagnosis. Brokers used it to place bets. Physicists used it to explore the mysteries of quantum entanglement. Farmers used it to grow food. Kindergartners used it to learn the alphabet. The feed was power, water, transportation, communication, entertainment, public services, relationships, industry, media, government, security, finance, and education. Without it, the churning torrent of human civilization would cease. The feed was lightning captured in grains of sand, a miracle of science, engineering, and culture that wove the entire world into a single digital tapestry of unparalleled beauty and complexity. Efficacy bred dependency. Turning it off was madness. The lights in the conference room went dark. The gentle background hum of the building's internal processes died. Diana's files vanished from the shared feed. No, not just her files. The feed itself was gone. It was as if Diana had just stepped through the red satin curtains, Nell's sure grip leading her into the exotic feedlessness of analog. But this wasn't analog. This was Commonwealth headquarters, the nerve center of the feed. Just a moment before, Diana had been a key node in the deluge of global attention. And now she was standing in the middle of an empty stadium. Her teammates vanished, the crowd abruptly absent, the cameras off, nothing but the frantic beating of her terrified heart and a distant ball rolling to a stop in the grass. The millions of voices that were her constant companion, always there, murmuring just below the threshold of hearing, had been silenced. The humble drinking cup that she constantly dipped into the font of all human knowledge had been slapped away. Her access to the vast prosthetic mind, whose presence she had long since taken for granted, had been severed. The lights in every window, in every skyscraper around them shut off, rippling out across San Francisco, the state, the country, the world, as feed-enabled electric grids failed. Every car in sight, from the streets of downtown to the Bay Bridge, froze as if captured in a still photograph. The container ships and yachts plying the bay coasted to a stop, their bow waves dissipating and their wakes catching up to make them bob where they sat marooned on the open water. The ominous swarm of drones and helicopters converging on them came to a halt in midair and then descended to land on the nearest patch of clear ground they could find per their emergency backup protocols. The convoy of trucks died along with all the civilian cars, their lights going dark and their sirens quiet. Diana imagined transoceanic flights automatically detouring to make emergency landings, surgeons whose equipment failed mid-craniotomy, soap operas dissolving in the midst of transcendent plot twists, control panels winking out before terrified astronauts, newsrooms descending into an unprecedented hush, nuclear power plants shutting down, a vocal track evaporating to reveal a pop star was lip-syncing to a packed arena, a trail map fading from an endurance runner's vision, ovens shutting off before the lasagna was ready, students cursing as their research papers melted away, Wall Street's algorithmic ballet extinguished right in front of Strader's eyes, a hidden sniper pulling the trigger to no effect, factories grinding to a halt, pumps ceasing to push wastewater through treatment facilities, and tourists at the Louvre being thrown into utter darkness. The world was a wind-up toy that had unexpectedly exhausted its clockwork motor. The feed was gone. Silence reigned.
Unbelievable. And this is Eliot Pepper reading from Borderless. That's the second part in the analog trilogy. And, Eliot, I realized that me describing the feed as a Facebook type thing is flawed in the sense that it's actually the Internet of Things paired with Facebook. I just meant Facebook in the terms of global dominance, because with the Internet of Things, we're not there yet. There is no real
Mm-hmm.
company stand-in, at least for the time being, a kind of a monopolistic power. But that's really important to understand for your story, is that the feed really runs all these other things too. I mean, absolutely. Uh, Everything: public transportation, private transportation, hospitals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
Mark Andreessen has that famous quote that software is eating the world, and so I'd say that maybe the quickest way to explain the future, the future in which these books takes place, and that this is a future where software has eaten the world.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, that's an important piece of context there. Thank you.
And we're heading towards the top of the hour, and I've been told by the producer that we can only go 10 minutes over today, but that means we're going to do our normal post game as usual. But the stream has to end, unfortunately, at the latest at 10 minutes past the hour. So I'm suggesting, this is a wonderful conversation, and I mean, we need like 3 hours for this show. Come on. My producers are brutal, but they need to rein me in. I come from public access where I can do whatever I want, and now the feed is telling me. They're telling me literally in the feed, Elliot. So let's go.
We have to obey them.
Yes, let's go to the reading number 3 from the
Sure.
conclusion, and this is Breach. Really briefly, before we do this, why did you choose Emily as your point of view? Because you had
Mm,
you have an amazing array of super interesting characters, and this is what I was thinking. Like, I was hoping that Emily would be the main, character. But you could have chosen any number. So real quick, why
sure.
did you choose her? I mean, you kind of said in the beginning that she was the beginning of everything, but why not Javier? Javier is this very dedicated hacktivist who hacked into the feed, and now he
Hmm.
has a position of power. I mean, he could have been good too.
So I knew it had to be Emily. So actually, one interesting thing that not very many people know about is that I never intended for this to be a trilogy. So when I wrote Bandwidth, I wrote it to be a standalone novel, and the book started with the idea for Emily, but she wasn't the point of view character. And then when I was talking to my editor about it, she suggested, "Hey, would you be interested in exploring this world a little more?" And I actually said no, because I was like, look, if I wanted to make this a series, I would have planned it as a series, and this was really a standalone story. And then I slept on it, and I realized that while Bandwidth was a standalone story, there were still other characters in that world that I wanted to get to know better, that I wanted to explore. And so I called her back, and we had a conversation about it, and I told her, look, um, if we're gonna do more than one book, it has to be three, because I don't want to write a duology. Like, it needs to be
Mhm.
one or three. And if we're going to do a trilogy, I want to set myself a creative challenge where, rather than being a traditional linear trilogy where it's one story told in three parts, I want each story to be able to stand alone. And I want each story to be told from a different point of view, so that you could actually start anywhere and proceed in any direction you chose, and sort of explore the world from there. And
Mhm.
so while we started with Dag in book one and then Diana in book two, because Emily was the seed that this whole world had grown from, I knew she had to be the main character of book three. And that actually made my life a lot harder because figuring out exactly what her journey was once I reached the point where I was starting to draft the novel took a lot of work. It took a lot of work to figure out where, the book 3 takes place 10 years after book 2. And she's really in a different place in her life, and the world has changed, and everything has changed. And then she goes on to change it yet again. And so it was a really, I'm really glad that I set myself that challenge, and it was a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine. I mean, it's
Yeah.
the construction, and we're going to shift the craft stuff for post game, and I will actually capture it, and people in the room will have the privilege to hear a little bit about the craft, so that we can do the reading and finish the live stream, and then we'll do a little bit of craft stuff. So now we're gonna hear from Breach, and set the scene for us.
So we're back on the island, as a matter of fact. So the island where the first excerpt took place, and where page 69 took place. Except now we've fast forwarded 13 years, and Emily is no longer the person she was when Drax read those first few paragraphs. She's been an outcast. She's had to rebuild everything in her life, and she's happened to rebuild a lot of the rest of the world around her along the way. And in this scene, she's talking to a dear friend, who's almost like a daughter to her, whose name is Rosa. And I think that's enough to set up this
Mhm.
little anecdote. So there's something special I want to show you, said Rosa. She led her downstairs and into the living room. There was something new built up against the inside wall, a wooden podium displaying a large vase. Its curves were lush, and the dark green ceramic was lined with golden seams that caught the flickering light from the fireplace. It's gorgeous, said Emily, peering this way and that to view it from different angles. It's the kintsugi, said Rosa, the one they delivered to my apartment. So this was the piece Lowell had convinced Midori to offer Rosa in order to manufacture a plausible excuse for the kidnappers to enter. Emily remembered taking her own first overwhelming steps into Rosa's apartment, the wonder of seeing her again in the flesh, the terror when the couriers revealed themselves, the crunch of spine under cleaver, the mad dash to safety. In Japanese art, kintsugi refers to the practice of repairing damaged pottery with gold cement, said Rosa. It dates back to a shogun who sent a tea set to China for repair and was disappointed when the pieces returned with ugly metal staples. Artisans sought to find a more aesthetic approach, and kintsugi was born. Emily could hear the enthusiasm underlying Rosa's words, the echo of years of careful study and appreciation. I'm not supposed to choose, but it's one of my very favorite forms. It turns an object into a visual history of itself, maintaining its internal narrative fidelity. Emotion swelled in her voice. Instead of trying to cover up the damage, the repairs illuminated, the imperfections transformed into a source of beauty. I've always seen kintsugi as a physical manifestation of mono no aware, the pathos of impermanence, the gentle awareness that everything, all of us, are fragile and transient, that change is the only constant, that we are, at our best, lovingly reconstructed patchworks of our shattered selves. Reflected in the shimmering lacquer, Emily saw 1,000 ghostly faces, the receding silhouettes of dreams realized and squandered, the fatal attraction of hubris, and the poignancy of heartbreak. She saw the roar of Fight Club crowds in the throes of bloodlust and the comforting drone of her father's stories. She tasted triumph, betrayal, and Titanic, and felt her mother's calloused hands guiding hers as she reassembled the telescope. Emily wasn't a singular coherent self. She was many voices competing in her head. She had let one voice dominate, and her identity had calcified. Like Commonwealth itself, her brittle map of the world no longer matched the changing territory, and she had to find new perspectives before life passed her by.
This is very cool, Eliot. Pepper reading from Breach. Thank you so much. Kintsugi, I put it in the local chat. This is something I was not familiar with. This is a wonderful, I guess, metaphor for healing and change, because all your characters, they go uh, through tremendous change, and they all grow, and they grow I mean, there is a logic to this. Again, really, kudos to how you constructed all this. Um, the transformation of all these characters is food for thought. We're at the top of the hour. We got 10 more minutes, and then we're going to go into the post game. Oh, look, Elliot sat back down. I said it I said it last time. Courtier Newland was the first person who was able to sit himself back down. You're the second person. That's great. We're progressing here. I mean, we can all change, as you suggest in the
There
book.
we go.
Um, what Just a couple of things here, that, and people, please repost your questions here in the local chat if you have questions. They ran by very fast, so just cut and paste them, and I will acknowledge them now, and pick them up. One question here was fascinating. One of the I mean, the bad guy, Lowell Harding, is a fascinating character. He's an ultra rich guy, comes from Texas, became rich in oil, and then was basically uh, um, getting richer, so to speak, through what is commonly referred to as disaster capitalism. As a matter of
Mhm.
fact, I just picked a bunch of books here. They're here on the ground here, in front of us. Naomi Klein's The Shock Doctrine, which I recommend highly. And if you don't want to read this big book, there's also a documentary, very very important, looking at how you can make shitloads of money. Excuse my French. By yeah, with the misery of others, and the misery and the decline of of the world. And you describe this as well. But Lowell says at one point, that the global wealth tax, which is proposed here, you talk
Mm.
about the global wealth tax, and the way you put it out there, I think, is brilliant. I agree that a global wealth tax is super important. And as a matter of fact, the feed, because everybody uses the feed, a positive side effect is that everybody's um, status is very transparent. So you
Mhm.
cannot really shift your money to offshore tax havens in your book, and that has the effect that we know how rich people, what their wealth is, and what is proposed is a global wealth tax based on this data that becomes very transparent. So that's a super interesting way that you put it. But Lowell says the global wealth tax, I'm paraphrasing here, uh, it's going to piss off all the rich people, and bring them up in arms. But also, he says, it will really alienate a lot of other constituents. And he says this to the progressive folks, like, "Yeah, you guys are crazy. If you implement this, you're going to bring up everybody against you." So I thought that was a really really good part here, because he's challenging their progressive aims here. They said, you're gonna piss off small minority religious groups, professional groups, maybe unions even. So yeah.
Yeah. So, Lowell was really fun to. I feel like villains are often really fun to write. And as you mentioned, he made his billions by drilling for oil in the Arctic and then buying up real estate in land that was not exposed to sea level rise and other effects of climate change. So as the oil he pumped was burned, it increased the value of his land, right? And
Hmm.
part of the
He
part of
destroyed part of the globe, and then shifted the refugees to another part where he happened to own real estate,
right.
make
So he
money.
profits both ways, right? And he creates this flywheel. And the reason why he's fun to write is not just because he's not just because he's so selfish, but also because he is just as astute an observer of the way that the world works and the systems in the world works as Emily and Dag and the other characters are. It's just
Hmm.
that he uses that knowledge for his own gain, right? And they are attempting to deconstruct those systems and push them in new directions, in a much less selfish way. And his the root of his observation about Commonwealth, the company that runs the feed, implementing a global wealth tax, is that, as you said, because the feed is this global information infrastructure, there's no such thing as an offshore haven, right? Like it covers the whole planet. So there's no place to run if you're going to engage in modern civilization, which the feed powers. So in that sense, it's the perfect vehicle for implementing any kind of progressive policy, right? Because it transcends the nation state. But at the same time, because it transcends the nation state, and because it is run by a global
Americans.
company,
Exactly, by a global company, but it happens to be
by a very
in San
small
Francisco.
group of Americans, right? Yeah, exactly. So because it's run by this very small group of people, and those people have no political accountability, right? So they may have the means by which to make some policies that all of us would be thrilled to support. But what Lowell is rightly pointing out, even though he's doing it for the wrong reasons, is that the minute that they start to leverage the global infrastructure they've built to make policy decisions, they are now engaging in a totally different type of activity. They are now start basically rewriting law, right, unilaterally and without any mechanism for democratic participation. And so that's super crucial to consider here. And so that's why he's right, even though he's also wrong.
Right, and the sovereignty of the nation state is threatened, of course, and then legitimate grievances can be voiced, and it's absolutely fascinating. The only solution is that, as you suggest, and you don't suggest a simple solution here as we wrap up the hour, which is awesome. You ask all these important questions, but digital sovereignty, which we didn't talk about, is of course something that needs to be implemented in my mind as well. I'm going to wrap up the hour. Eliot Peper, thank you so much for coming. Please stick around. We're going to do a little post game until the bottom of the hour for just our VIP crowd. If you couldn't get in, a bunch of people have messaged us that we were full. Some people may be leaving, so please try to teleport in again. Super big thank you again, Eliot Peper. Big thanks to the audience here, folks on the stream as well. Super big thanks to my team. Shyla, wonderful research. Ruby, building this club, absolutely amazing. Arieto helping out, Silas making avatars. Please post your pictures on our Second Life Book Club Flickr group, spread the word. And also Arieto is reminding me that we have a Discord. There's a little stand here. You click on it and it shoots you to the Discord. You can discuss books and everything. And speaking of books, wait a minute. We spoke about books for for a long time. Inspired by Eliot's afterword, where you actually talk about reading. Real quick, one word answer, and everybody else can put this in chat. What are you reading right now? Please put that in chat, and if you want to go to the Discord, do that too. But Eliot, most importantly, what are you reading right now?
I am reading a really wonderful and totally weird little novel called Mezzanine. And the description will not convince you to read it, but you should anyway. The novel is about...
Oh, don't tempt me. That's exactly what I usually
it's
pick
wonderful.
up.
Yeah, so the entire novel, it's a short novel, but the entire novel is about a man going up an escalator. So the whole novel takes place across his escalator ride, simply going from one floor to another on an escalator. And the brilliance of the novel is that it takes that frame, which couldn't sound more banal, and it expands it into this incredible story that teases out the smallest, most interesting details and anomalies in life, and then all the way up to the biggest questions and everything in between. So I highly recommend it. It's a lot of fun.
Oh boy, the reads that gets bigger. Well, I mean that does sound super enticing. Um, Folks, oh, Stella has his. She's starting A Gentleman in Moscow. Please
Oh,
post your stuff here. We'll talk about it a little
Stella,
bit.
one of my favorite books. Amazing. I really hope you enjoy it.
We need to find a way to curate all this stuff. There's an island up there on the 2,000-meter level here on Book Club Island where you can also post that. So next week we have a show, and again, I cannot promise that we can keep up this pace and building a new place every week. We're also running out of space. I mean, the island is huge. We have like, I don't know, 20 different places or something. Next week, we have a panel from the independent publisher, the Parliament, called the Parliament House. They call themselves a boutique sci-fi fantasy horror press. So I stumbled across them, and three authors, Nicole Wilson, Sean Gibson, and E.M. Wright, are coming. Um, Super excited about that. I haven't read any of their work, but I'm going to start at the bottom of the hour because this is now a full-time job. And I hope to see all of you guys again next week here, 12 o'clock Second Life time on the Second Life Book Club.
And I just want to thank you again and the team that put all of this together. This is a really special event, and it's such a treat to be able to actually have this conversation in analog.